In May of 1916, two men sat down together in a room in London, one British, one French, and divided a territory roughly the size of Western Europe between them. They did this in secret. They did this without the knowledge, let alone the consent, of the people who actually lived in the territory they were dividing. They did this with a pencil and a map, and the lines they drew that afternoon, these lines, made in wartime, in secret, by two men who between them had spent very limited time in the places they were casually parceling out, became the borders of countries that are still, as of today, bleeding along those seams. The British diplomat's name was Sir Mark Sykes. He was 36 years old, a Yorkshire baronet, a traveller, a writer, a member of Parliament, and a man whose confidence in his own understanding of the Middle East was, to put it charitably, not entirely commensurate with the depth of that understanding. He had traveled in the region. He had opinions about Arabs, vivid, colorful, condescending opinions that read today like a masterclass in the particular kind of affectionate contempt with which educated Edwardians viewed the populations they were governing. He once described his ideal Arab as a cross between a Turk and a Frenchman, which, when you think about it, tells you nothing whatsoever about Arabs, and a great deal about Sykes. The French diplomat's name was François Georges-Picot. He was 45, a career diplomat, formerly the Consul General of France in Beirut, which meant he actually had somewhat more ground-level experience of the region than his British counterpart. He was quiet where Sykes was flamboyant, methodical where Sykes was intuitive. His goal in this negotiation was clear and, from a French national interest perspective, rational. He was there to make sure France got what France had been promised, which was a significant chunk of what was then called Syria, a geographical term that at the time covered roughly modern Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, and parts of Jordan. Between them, these two men negotiated what would become known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement formally. The Ottoman Agreement signed on May 16. You may not have heard of it. You have felt it, if you live in or pay attention to Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, or Kuwait. You have felt it. If you watch the chaos that followed the 2003 invasion of Iraq, a country that many experts had been warning for decades was held together more by the strength of its government than by any natural internal cohesion, you have felt it. If you watch the Syrian civil war, which began in 2011 and displaced more than 12 million people, if you have felt it. If you watched ISIS declare a caliphate in 2014 and begin systematically bulldozing border-crossing markers between Iraq and Syria while declaring that they were erasing Sykes-Picot, well, at that point, the name started showing up in newspaper headlines. And you may have wondered what it was. Here is what it was. It was a meeting. It was a map. It was an afternoon in London in 1916. It was two men who believed with the calm, untroubled certainty of people who have never had to question whether their civilization's frameworks apply everywhere, that a territory which had been organized by its own logic for centuries could be reorganized by their logic. In an afternoon, it was, in the most literal possible sense, the afternoon when the modern Middle East was invented, not discovered, not liberated, not peacefully reorganized by mutual consent. Invented, between men, with a pencil. This episode is the story of that afternoon, and of the century of consequences that followed it. It is the story of what Sykes and Picot knew, what they didn't know, what they chose not to know, and what they apparently couldn't have cared less about knowing. It is the story of how the borders they drew in 1916 lines that do not follow rivers, mountains, ethnic concentration, historical communities, or any other geographic or human logic became the borders that armies have died defending and insurgencies have died trying to erase. It is, in the end, the story of a map, and of all the things a map can do when it is drawn by the wrong people, for the wrong reasons, at exactly the wrong moment in history. Let's go back to London, because the story, as always, has a very specific address, and a very specific smell, the particular mixture of pipe smoke, diplomatic anxiety, and confident ignorance that tends to permeate rooms where empires make decisions about other people's countries. To understand why Sykes and Picot were in that room in 1916, you need to understand what the world looked like at the end of 1915. The First World War was going badly, not just for one side, for everyone. The Western Front had collapsed into a grinding stalemate of industrial-scale killing in which hundreds of thousands of men were dying for territorial gains that could be measured in hundreds of yards. Gallipoli had been a catastrophe. The Russian army was under serious pressure on the Eastern Front. The British Empire was straining every resource it had from Canada to Australia to India to Egypt to feed a war machine that seemed capable of consuming everything and producing nothing except trenches and graves. Into this situation, the Ottoman Empire had entered the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary in late October 1914. This was, from the Allied perspective, both a strategic problem and, in a certain callous imperial sense, an opportunity. A strategic problem because it opened new fronts: the Caucasus, Mesopotamia, the Sinai. An opportunity because the Ottoman Empire, which European powers had been calling the sick man of Europe since at least the mid-19th century, had been visibly and demonstrably weakening for decades. Its territories were vast. Its administration was stretched. Its military had been losing wars in the Balkans, and it sat atop some of the most strategically significant real estate on the planet: the overland route to India, the approaches to the Suez Canal, the lands adjacent to what was not yet known to be, but would soon become the most consequential energy resource in modern history. The Ottoman Empire was, in 1914, dying. The question that Britain and France, the two dominant powers in the region, were urgently asking in 1915 was, when it dies, who gets what? This is not, to be clear, a question that either government was asking with any visible discomfort about its own moral foundations. The premise that the territories of a collapsing empire should be divided among the powers that defeated it, regardless of what the people in those territories might want, was, in 1915, simply the ambient assumption of great power politics. It was not controversial. It was not questioned. It was the way the world worked. The British Empire and the French Empire had been dividing other people's territories between them for the better part of 3 centuries. One more division was not, in their framework, a moral problem. It was a logistical one. The logistical problem had several dimensions. First, Russia. Russia was an allied power. Russia also had interests in the region, specifically in Constantinople and the Straits, which it had been coveting for the better part of 2 centuries. Any agreement about the post-war division of Ottoman territories had to include Russia, or Russia would simply make its own arrangements. So the negotiations that eventually produced the Sykes-Picot Agreement were actually 3-way negotiations: Britain, France, and Russia. The Russian dimension is usually forgotten, partly because the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 would take Russia out of the war entirely and render Russian territorial claims moot, and partly because the Sykes-Picot Agreement doesn't have quite the same ring to it. But it was there, and it is important, and we will return to what the Bolsheviks did with this information. Second, the Arabs This is where it gets genuinely complicated and genuinely revealing about the moral architecture of British imperial thinking. In June 1915, the British government, specifically the High Commissioner in Egypt, Sir Henry McMahon, began a correspondence with Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, the hereditary custodian of the Islamic holy cities, and the most prestigious Arab leader in the Ottoman world. The correspondence continued until March 1916, and in the course of this correspondence, McMahon made what any reasonable person reading the letters would understand as a promise. Britain would support Arab independence in a substantial portion of the Arab territories of the Ottoman Empire. In exchange for Arab support, specifically an Arab revolt against Ottoman rule during the war, the Sharif of Mecca understood this as a promise of independence. His son Faisal, who would become the commander of the Arab forces in the revolt, understood it as a promise of independence. T.I.S. Lawrence of Arabia, who spent years in the field with the Arab forces and had read the correspondence, understood it as a promise that Britain did not intend to keep and felt personally responsible for perpetuating under false pretenses. This is a significant data point. Lawrence knew. He helped anyway. The psychological weight of that knowledge contributed significantly to the famous breakdown he experienced in the years after the war. The Arab revolt launched in June 1916. The same month, the Sykes-Picot Agreement was being finalized. The Arabs were fighting, at least in part, because they had been told that their fight would lead to independence. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, signed by Britain and France, divided the territories those Arabs were fighting to liberate between Britain and France. Let that sit for a moment. While Arab fighters were dying in the desert on the basis of British promises of independence, British diplomats in London were secretly agreeing with French diplomats to partition those same territories between their two empires. This is not a complicated moral situation. The complexity comes later, in the rationalizations. Before we get to the map itself, we need to understand something about the specific context in which these negotiations took place, because the timing is important in ways that tend to get lost when we zoom out to the big picture. The Gallipoli campaign had ended in disaster in December 1915. January 1916. More than 250,000 Allied soldiers had been killed or wounded in the attempt to force the Dardanelles and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. The campaign's failure was not just military. It was political, personal, and deeply humiliating for the British and French governments. The man most associated with the strategic initiative, Winston Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, had resigned from cabinet in November 1915 as the fiasco became undeniable. The failure at Gallipoli intensified, rather than diminished, British interest in the Middle Eastern theater. If you couldn't knock the Ottomans out from the sea, you would have to do it from the land. The Mesopotamian campaign, the British advance up the Tigris and Euphrates river valleys toward Baghdad, was ongoing. It was, at the point the Sykes-Picot negotiations began, going badly. A British force had been besieged at Kut, and the eventual fall of Kut in April 1916 would be one of the largest surrenders in British military history. The pressure to show some progress, some strategic vision, some plan for the post-war order, was intense. This context explains both the urgency of the Sykes-Picot negotiations and some of their qualities, decisions made under wartime pressure, by men who were trying to simultaneously manage a failing military campaign, maintain an alliance with France, keep Russia in the war, and prevent the Arabs from cutting their own deals with the Ottomans. These decisions are not made with the methodical care that a peacetime reorganization of a continent might receive. They are made fast. They are made with the tools at hand. They are made to manage immediate problems, and the long-term consequences are somebody else's problem. This is not an excuse, but it is context. The Sykes-Picot Agreement has sometimes been portrayed as the product of cold, calculating imperial cynicism. Two men sitting down with a globe and a property list, dividing the world with contemptuous efficiency. The reality is rather more chaotic. It was the product of exhausted men, in wartime, trying to reconcile incompatible interests under enormous pressure, with limited time and even more limited knowledge of the territory they were organizing. The result was, if anything, worse than cold calculation would have produced. Cold calculation might at least have taken the demographics seriously. The actual product was an improvisation, a workable compromise between British and French imperial interests, arrived at by two relatively junior diplomats, that no one in either government looked at with sufficient critical attention before they signed it. Now, who were the men doing this? And what did they actually agree to? Mark Sykes was, by the standards of his time and class, a genuine expert on the Middle East. He had traveled extensively in the region as a young man: Ottoman Turkey, Syria, Mesopotamia, Palestine, and had written a book about his travels called Darul Islam, published in 1904. He was, in the language of the era, a student of the Orient. He had strong views. He was influential. And he was, in ways that are important to understand, genuinely enthusiastic about the Arab world. He found it romantic, fascinating, worthy of engagement. This made him, in his own estimation, a sympathetic figure. What it did not make him was someone who thought that Arabs should govern themselves. The view that animated Sykes and that animated a significant portion of the educated British establishment of his generation was a particular kind of paternalistic imperialism. The view was not that Eastern peoples were worthless or uninteresting. The view was that they were not yet ready, that they needed guidance, that the civilizational development which Britain and France had achieved over centuries could be provided more quickly from outside. That empire was not exploitation. It was, in the language of the period, a civilizing mission, and that this mission was, in its own way, a form of generosity. If this sounds patronizing, it should. If it sounds like the rationalization of a system that extracted enormous wealth from colonized territories while providing development that was calibrated primarily to facilitate further extraction, that is because that is largely what it was. Sykes believed he was doing the Arabs a favor. There is a note he wrote in 1915 describing what he envisioned for the post-war Arab world: a belt of jolly little Arab states under British and French oversight, developing at their own pace, guided by the wisdom of more advanced civilizations. Jolly little Arab states. This is a phrase that deserves to sit in silence for a moment. The men whose political future Sykes was casually sketching in his letters were fighting and dying in the desert at the same time. But they were, in Sykes's mental architecture, decorative elements in a geopolitical landscape that he and his counterparts were designing. François Georges-Picot believed France had historic and cultural claims in Syria dating back to the Crusades, and if that seems like an unusual historical argument for a 20th century diplomatic negotiation, you are not wrong. But it was genuinely made. France's connection to the Christian communities of the Levant, particularly the Maronite Catholics of the Lebanese mountain region, gave French policymakers a sincere conviction that France had a protective and civilizational role to play in the region. Picot was not a cartoonish villain. He was a man who believed in his country's mission, in his country's interests, and in the absolute right of great powers to organize smaller territories according to their own strategic logic. The negotiation that Sykes and Picot conducted between November 1915 and May 1916 with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Sazonov engaged in parallel produced a map divided into zones. Let's be precise about what they agreed to. Because the details matter. The agreement divided the region into 5 zones, using a color coding system that has become somewhat infamous. The red zone, Britain's direct control area, covered the lower parts of Mesopotamia, including Baghdad and Basra, plus the ports of Acre and Haifa on the Palestinian coast. This was the area where British interests were most direct. Mesopotamia for its strategic position on the route to India, and the Palestinian ports for access to the Mediterranean. The Blue Zone, France's direct control area, covered what is roughly modern Lebanon, the coastal strip of Syria, and the southeastern quarter of what is now Turkey. This was France's claim to the Levantine coast, grounded in its relationship with the Maronite Christian community and its commercial and cultural ties to the region. Area A, the French sphere of influence, nominally to be governed by an Arab state or confederation under French guidance, covered the interior of modern Syria and the areas around Mosul in northern Mesopotamia. Area B, the British sphere of influence, similarly nominal, covered the interior of what is now Jordan, the Negev, and a large portion of the Arabian Peninsula. And then there was what was sometimes called the Brown Zone, or the International Zone, covering roughly the area of Palestine west of the Jordan River, including Jerusalem. This was not allocated to either Britain or France, in recognition of the fact that Palestine's status as the site of the Christian holy places made it politically impossible for either power to simply claim it. It was to be administered in accordance with an agreement between Russia, France, and Great Britain, in consultation with other allies, and the representatives of the Sheriff of Mecca. This last point deserves special attention, because it was a lie of a very specific kind. The promise to consult the representatives of the Sheriff of Mecca about Palestine's future was made at the precise moment when the Sheriff of Mecca was being given no consultation whatsoever about the fact that the rest of the region was being divided up without him. It was a promise made to manage optics in a document that was secret. It was, in other words, a promise made to no one about something that had already been decided, in a document that the person it supposedly concerned would not read until it had already been overtaken by events. Mark Sykes was proud of this map. He described the agreed line of division running, in his memorable phrase, from the E in Acre to the last K in Kirkuk, with what seems to have been genuine satisfaction. He thought it was a fair compromise between British and French interests. He thought it left room for Arab development under European guidance. There is a document from 1915 that has become something of a dark joke among historians of the Middle East. In it, Mark Sykes describes the Arab peoples in terms that tell you everything about the epistemic framework in which the Sykes-Picot Agreement was conceived. He describes Syrian Arabs as people who would in time be capable of self-government, provided they received the right guidance. He described Bedouin tribesmen as noble but impractical. His overall framework was that of a naturalist, describing species, interesting, varied, worthy of study, but not agents of their own political destiny. This is not a framework that produces good governance of other people's territories. It is a framework that produces the Sykes-Picot Agreement, a document in which the question of what the people in the territory actually want is simply not part of the analytical structure. It is not that Sykes considered and rejected the idea of consulting Arab preferences. It is that the question did not present itself to him as a question. The Arabs were the landscape. He was the cartographer. This framework had consequences that went far beyond the specific lines drawn on the 1916 map. It shaped the entire subsequent relationship between the mandatory powers and the populations under their mandates. It produced a style of governance advisory, paternalistic, condescending, that generated constant resentment without ever quite producing the stability it claimed to be building. And it produced, in the Arab populations who lived through the mandate period, a deep and lasting suspicion of Western intentions that has shaped Middle Eastern politics from the 1920s to the present day. He was 36 years old. He had spent several months of his life in the region. He had drawn a line across a map that determined the political future of millions of people. And, crucially, he had done all of this without asking any of those millions of people what they thought. Here is the first thing Sykes and Picot didn't know, or chose not to know, or knew and didn't care about. The territory they were dividing was not empty. I am aware that this statement seems almost embarrassingly obvious. And yet, and this is one of the more psychologically revealing aspects of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the way in which the negotiations proceeded, the categories they used, the logic they applied, all suggest that the people actually inhabiting the territory in question were not, at any point, the central consideration. They were an administrative variable, a governance challenge, a population to be managed. Let's talk about what was actually there. The Arab world of 1916 was not a monolith. It was not a uniform mass of interchangeable people who would slot neatly into whatever political structure European diplomats designed for them. It was one of the most complex human mosaics on Earth, a territory shaped by millennia of migration, conquest, religious development, trade, and cultural exchange, in which dozens of distinct communities had developed their own identities, their own hierarchies, their own relationships with the governing Ottoman authority, their own local political structures, and their own visions of what they wanted from any future political arrangement. Let me give you some specific examples of what Sykes and Picot were casually reorganizing in Iraq, or rather, in the three Ottoman provinces of Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra, which would eventually be welded together into a single British-controlled territory. There were at least three major communities with profoundly different characters, histories, and political interests. The Shia Arabs of the south and the marshes around Basra made up somewhere around 60% of the total population and had deep religious ties to the holy cities of Najaf and Karbala, cities of enormous significance to Shia Islam worldwide. The Sunni Arabs of the central region around Baghdad, though a demographic minority, had historically provided the governing and administrative class under Ottoman rule. And in the north, the Kurds, not Arabs at all, but a distinct ethnic and linguistic community with their own culture, their own tribal structures, and their own increasingly articulated aspirations for some form of political autonomy, occupied the mountains and valleys around Mosul. These three communities had coexisted under Ottoman administration, but that coexistence was managed, tainted, and built on arrangements that would not survive the dismantling of Ottoman governance. Welding these three communities into a single Iraq governed by a British-appointed Arab monarch was not, as anyone with a serious knowledge of the region would have been able to tell you, a recipe for stable self-government. It was a recipe for the exact situation that Iraq has experienced for virtually its entire existence as a state, a Sunni-led government suppressing a Shia majority, while the Kurds in the north pursue varying degrees of autonomy. In Syria, the broad territory that the French were claiming for their sphere of influence, the situation was, if anything, more complex. The coastal region of what is now Lebanon was home to the Maronite Christian community whose protection France claimed as its special mission, but the same region was also home to Greek Orthodox Christians. Druze, a heterodox Islamic sect with its own distinct identity and a long tradition of fierce independence Alawites, another heterodox community that would eventually, in one of history's more improbable political trajectories, come to dominate the Syrian state, and a Sunni Muslim majority that was not particularly enthusiastic about French oversight. The interior of Syria, the great trading cities of Damascus and Aleppo, was overwhelmingly Sunni Arab, and had been the center of the nascent Arab nationalist movement that was one of the most politically significant intellectual developments in the region. In the early 20th century, Arab nationalism, the idea that Arabs constituted a nation with a right to political self-determination, along the lines that European nationalist movements had been asserting for the previous century, was not a peripheral or extremist idea in 1916. It was the mainstream political aspiration of educated Arab society. It was precisely the aspiration that the Hussein McMahon correspondence had engaged with, and that Britain had implicitly, and Arab leaders believed, explicitly endorsed in exchange for Arab military cooperation in the war. Sykes and Picot divided this territory between two European empires. Then there were the Kurds. The Kurds occupy a special place in the history of the Sykes-Picot settlement, and in the history of broken promises more generally, because they were promised something, actually promised it, in a formal peace treaty, and then had that promise retracted when it became politically inconvenient. The Kurdish people numbered somewhere between 10 and 15 million in the early 20th century. They occupied a broad territory across what would become southeastern Turkey, northern Iraq, northeastern Syria, and northwestern Iran, a territory that, under a different set of post-war arrangements, might plausibly have become a Kurdish state. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed in August 1920 by the Allied powers and the remnants of the Ottoman government, included provisions for Kurdish autonomy and a path toward potential Kurdish independence in Articles 62 through 64. This was not a rumor or an informal suggestion. It was in the treaty. 3 years later, and the Treaty of Lausanne, negotiated after Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's nationalist movement had defeated the Allied-backed forces in Turkey and reorganized Turkish sovereignty on new terms, made no mention of the Kurds at all. Kurdistan vanished from the diplomatic map in 1923. It has not reappeared on any internationally recognized map since. The Kurdish population, which today numbers between 25 and 35 million, making it the largest ethnic group in the world without a state of its own, has spent the century since Lausanne alternating between armed struggle, diplomatic efforts, and varying degrees of cultural suppression in each of the four countries where they form significant minorities. The Turkish Kurds have lived through multiple insurgencies and state-sponsored campaigns of cultural erasure. The Iraqi Kurds survived Saddam Hussein's Anfal campaign in 1986-1989, in which somewhere between 50,000 and 182,000 Kurdish civilians were killed in what international bodies have characterized as a genocide. The Syrian Kurds have been caught between Assad, ISIS, Turkey, and a shifting set of great power interests throughout the Syrian civil war. All of this, every bit of it, flows from borders that were drawn, or not drawn, in a period of European great power negotiation, in which what the Kurds wanted was an afterthought at best and a nuisance at worst. But here is where the story gets truly remarkable in its cynicism. None of what I have just described, not the Shia-Sunni Kurdish complexity of Iraq, not the sectarian mosaic of Syria, not the Kurdish aspiration for statehood, was unknown information in 1916. British and French officials had access to detailed reports from consuls, missionaries, archaeologists, intelligence officers, and military advisors who had extensive knowledge of the region's demographics and politics. The information existed. It was filed. It was available. It was not consulted in a way that mattered, because consulting it seriously would have complicated the negotiation. And the negotiation had a clear purpose: to divide the territory between Britain and France in a way that satisfied both powers' strategic interests. The people in the territory were a secondary consideration. Their preferences, their communities, their existing political structures, these were inputs to be managed, not constraints to be respected. This is not a cynical reading imposed by hindsight. It is the reading supported by the documentary record. When Lord Curzon, the former Viceroy of India, and a man who knew colonial administration intimately reviewed the Sykes-Picot Agreement, he called it a thoroughly bad and mischievous settlement that would create a hornet's nest in the region. He was not alone in this assessment. There were voices at the time, British, French, Arab, American, who understood that drawing borders without reference to the populations they enclosed was a recipe for permanent instability. Those voices were not heeded. And then, in November 1917, the situation got measurably worse, because on November 2, 1917, Arthur James Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, sent a letter to Walter Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community, stating that the British government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. This letter is known as the Balfour Declaration. It is, in terms of its consequences for human history, one of the most consequential single documents of the 20th century. And it was written at a moment when Britain had already made, through the Hussein McMahon correspondence, promises about the same territory to the Arabs, and had already agreed through Sykes-Picot to internationalize Palestine, rather than assign it to any single power. To be very clear about what was happening by the end of 1917, Britain had made 3 separate sets of promises about the same territory. The 3 different parties, at least 2 of which were mutually incompatible, to the Arabs, through Hussein McMahon, independence in Arab territories, with the status of Palestine, ambiguous but understood by the Arabs to be included, to the French, through Sykes-Picot, Palestine to be internationally administered, with surrounding territories divided between British and French influence, to the Jewish community, through the Balfour Declaration, support for a national home in Palestine. These 3 promises cannot all be kept simultaneously. This is not a difficult mathematical problem. A territory cannot be both internationally administered and a national home for a specific people. A people cannot be both granted independence and placed under the protection of a power that has simultaneously promised that same territory to a different movement with different goals. Somebody was going to be betrayed. Given the power dynamics involved, Britain and France were the powers. The Arabs and the Jewish communities were the clients. The outcome of that betrayal was not exactly mysterious. It is worth pausing here to understand why Britain was making all these promises simultaneously. The answer is not simply incompetence or cynicism. Though both were present, the answer is that in 1917, Britain was desperate. The war was going catastrophically. The United States had entered in April 1917, but American forces would not be fully deployed for months. Russia was in revolutionary turmoil. France had suffered devastating mutinies after the failure of the Nivelle offensive. Britain needed everything it could get: Arab military cooperation in the Middle East, Jewish influence to help keep Russia in the war, and to shape American public opinion, French cooperation to hold the alliance together. The promises multiplied because the need multiplied, and the territory that everyone wanted to be promised, Palestine, was small enough and sufficiently distant from the immediate battlefield that the contradiction could be managed, or at least deferred. The British government's calculation, to the extent that there was a unified calculation, appears to have been: make the promises now, win the war, and sort out the contradictions afterward. This is a familiar pattern in the history of political promises. The peculiarity of the Palestine case is that afterward never arrived. The contradictions were never sorted out. Each attempt to resolve the incompatibility of British promises simply generated new conflicts that persist to the present day. But here is the additional element that makes this moment even more extraordinary. It was at precisely this point, the end of 1917, that the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement became public and it did not become public through a whistleblower, or a brave journaliste, or a parliamentary challenge. It became public because of the Russian Revolution. In October 1917, the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia. They immediately withdrew Russia from the war and, in a gesture of revolutionary transparency or strategic embarrassment infliction, depending on how you read it, they published all the secret treaties their predecessors had signed, including the Sykes-Picot Agreement, including the Russian annex that had granted Russia Constantinople and the Turkish Straits in exchange for acquiescing to the Anglo-French partition. The Arab press obtained copies almost immediately. Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, who had launched the Arab revolt on the basis of British promises, was sent a translation by the Ottoman government, which was delighted to use it as propaganda. British officials scrambled to assure Hussein that the agreement didn't mean what it clearly meant, that it was a wartime contingency rather than a binding commitment, that Arab interests were fully protected. Hussein was not reassured. He had cause to be suspicious, but he was, at this point, militarily and economically dependent on British support, and the Arab revolt was ongoing, and the practical alternative to continuing was not clear, so he kept fighting. He kept fighting for promises he had been told were genuine. He kept fighting for an independence that had already been divided up in secret. He kept fighting. In other words, folie. This is not a morally complicated moment. It is simply a betrayal. The war ended in November 1918. The Ottoman Empire had lost. The Allied powers had won. The moment of reckoning, the moment when the promises made, the agreement signed, and the realities on the ground would all have to be reconciled with each other, had arrived. It went about as well as you would expect, given everything described in the previous 2 chapters, which is to say, badly, which is to say, in ways whose consequences are still accumulating. The Paris Peace Conference opened in January 1919. It was, in many respects, a remarkable gathering, the largest diplomatic conference in history up to that point, attended by representatives of 32 nations, tasked with redesigning the post-war world from the Balkans to the Pacific. President Woodrow Wilson of the United States attended in person, bringing with him the 14 points of framework for post-war peace that included, prominently, the principle of self-determination, the idea that people should have the right to determine their own political futures, self-determination, the right of peoples to govern themselves. It was, in 1919, a genuinely exciting idea. It was exciting to the Poles, who wanted a Polish state. It was exciting to the Czechs and Slovaks. It was exciting, with somewhat less eventual outcome. To the Vietnamese, Ho Chi Minh traveled to Paris specifically to petition for Vietnamese self-determination and was turned away from the conference without a hearing. And it was exciting to the Arabs. Faisal bin Hussein, son of the Sharif of Mecca, commander of the Arab forces that had fought alongside Britain, and the man who had been led to believe that his father's revolt would result in an independent Arab state, attended the Paris Peace Conference as the representative of the Arab Kingdom of Syria. He presented, with T.E. Lawrence translating, the case for Arab independence. He had assembled a memorandum laying out the Arab claim to the territories their armies had helped to liberate. Wilson received Faisal warmly. He expressed sympathy with Arab aspirations. He was genuinely committed, in principle, to self-determination. He was not, however, able to force Britain and France to honor promises they had made, and Britain and France were not inclined to honor those promises. The instrument through which the promises were evaded was elegant in its hypocrisy. It was called the mandate system. Under the Covenant of the League of Nations, the international body established after the war, which Wilson championed and which the U.S. Senate then refused to join, leaving the whole enterprise somewhat toothless. The former territories of the defeated empires were not simply seized and colonized. That would have been too embarrassing in 1919, particularly given Wilson's rhetoric. Instead, they were placed under mandates, assignments to specific powers to administer the territories on behalf of the international community, with the stated goal of guiding them toward eventual self-government and independence. The difference between a mandate and a colony was, in practice, almost entirely notional. The mandatory power controlled the territory. The mandatory power set the laws, organized the administration, allocated the land, determined immigration policy, and deployed military force to suppress resistance. The people in the territory had no meaningful say in any of this. The eventual self-government was always somewhere in the future, contingent on meeting standards that the mandatory power defined and could always declare had not yet been met. The mandate, in other words, was colonialism, with better public relations. France received the mandate for Syria and Lebanon. Britain received the mandates for Mesopotamia, Palestine, and Transjordan. Let's look at each of these in turn, because the details of how each territory was carved reveal the particular forms of short-sightedness and self-interest at work. Iraq first. Iraq, as a political entity, did not exist before the British created it. The territory that became Iraq consisted of 3 Ottoman provinces, Mosul, Baghdad, and Basra, that had been administered separately, that had quite different demographic compositions, and that had no particular tradition of common political identity. The decision to weld them together was driven by British strategic and economic interest. The Baghdad-Basra area was the core of the Mesopotamian theater of operations. Mosul sat atop oil deposits of potentially enormous value, and having a single unified territory under British control was administratively more convenient than managing 3 separate units. The fact that combining Mosul's Kurdish majority population with Baghdad's Sunni Arab governing class and Basra's Shia Arab majority created a territory with no shared political culture, competing interests, and a structural tendency toward the domination of the majority by the well-positioned minority. This was understood at the time. British officials in Mesopotamia repeatedly warned London that the 3 provinces had little in common and that forced unity would be unstable. London proceeded anyway. And then, in 1920, Iraq told Britain exactly what it thought of this arrangement. The Great Iraqi Revolt of 1920, sometimes called the Iraqi Revolution of 1920, is not well known in Western popular history, but it should be. It was one of the largest anti-colonial uprisings of the early 20th century, beginning in May and escalating through the summer of 1920. A broad coalition of Iraqi tribes, urban nationalists, Shia religious leaders, and Sunni Arab officers who had served in the Ottoman army rose against British rule. At its peak, the revolt involved somewhere between 130,000 and 180,000 fighters across vast stretches of central and southern Iraq. The fighting was intense and brutal. British and Indian forces suffered thousands of casualties. Estimates of Iraqi dead range from 6,000 to 10,000 or more. Though the figures are contested, the revolt was suppressed, at great cost, and with the use of air power, the Royal Air Force, under Hugh Trenchard, conducted bombing campaigns against Iraqi villages that represented, in the words of the official RAF history, cheap policing of restless colonial populations. Churchill, now colonial secretary, was a supporter of using air power for colonial control. He had, in a 1919 memo, expressed no particular ethical discomfort with the use of chemical weapons against uncivilized tribes in Mesopotamia, a detail that illuminates the moral universe in which British colonial policy was being made. The revolt did, however, produce one significant political consequence. It convinced the British government that direct administration of Iraq was too expensive and too politically costly. The solution was the mandate system with local faces, a Hashemite monarchy under British oversight. Faisal, who had been expelled from Damascus by the French, was imported to Baghdad and installed as King of Iraq in 1921, in a referendum in which he received 96% of the vote. This was not, historians agree, a competitive election. The oil question deserves special emphasis here, because it is insufficiently acknowledged in popular discussions of Sykes-Picot and its consequences. In 1916, when the agreement was signed, the commercial significance of Mesopotamian oil was suspected but not confirmed. The major oil fields were not definitively located and assessed until after the war, through exploration in the early 1920s. But the suspicion was there. British geological surveys had been pointing toward major oil deposits in the region since before the war, and it operated as an unspoken factor in the determination to maintain British control over Mesopotamia. When the oil turned out to be as significant as suspected, when the Iraq Petroleum Company began commercial extraction in the 1920s, and when the scale of the reserves became clear, the argument for keeping Iraq within and the British sphere of influence acquired a dimension of material self-interest that went well beyond anything that could be rationalized as a civilizing mission. Britain needed that oil. The British Navy had converted from coal to oil before the war, on Churchill's initiative, making access to petroleum a matter of national security. The borders that trapped Iraq's oil within British-controlled territory were not incidental to British policy. They were, in a very real sense, the point. Kuwait deserves a specific mention here, because it is the single clearest example of a border created entirely and explicitly by British imperial interests. With no pretense of any other rationale, Kuwait was carved out of the Basra province of Mesopotamia, what would have been the southern end of Iraq, as a separate entity under British protection. The reason was simple. British India needed a reliable port on the Persian Gulf under direct British control, and a Kuwait that was a separate protectorate was a more useful piece of strategic geography than a Kuwait that was merely the southern tip of a potentially restless Arab state. The Emir of Kuwait had accepted British protection in 1899. His successors maintained it. When Iraq became nominally independent in 1932, Kuwait remained under British protection, a small, rich statelet that Iraq consistently claimed as its own territory, since it had been part of the Basra Vilayet. The historical irony, or, if you prefer, the historical consequences of Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in August 1990. His stated justification included the argument that Kuwait was historically part of Iraq, a territory artificially separated by British colonialism. He was not wrong that Kuwait's independent existence was the product of British strategic decision-making, rather than any organic historical development. He was entirely wrong that this justified conquest and annexation. But the raw material for the grievance, the artificial separation of Kuwait from the Iraqi state, was provided by the same colonial decision-making that produced Sykes-Picot. Now Syria. France's conduct in Syria is, if anything, more immediately damaging than Britain's in Iraq, because it combined imperial ambition with active internal manipulation in ways that created structural problems almost instantaneously. France divided Greater Syria into multiple units. The coastal area, the mountain region dominated by the Maronite Christians and the Alawite communities, was separated from the interior and given an expanded political identity as Greater Lebanon, formally established as a distinct entity in 1920. The reasoning was that French protection of the Christian communities of the Levant, a historic French commitment going back centuries, could be institutionalized by giving those communities a state of their own. There were several problems with this reasoning. First, the area designated as Greater Lebanon was significantly larger than the area where Maronite Christians were a majority. The expansion of Lebanese territory beyond the historic Maronite heartland in the mountain region was done specifically to create an economically viable state. The Maronites' mountain enclave was not self-sufficient, but it meant incorporating large Sunni Muslim populations in the Bekaa Valley and the coastal cities of Tripoli, Sidon, and Tyre, who had not been consulted about their incorporation and were not uniformly enthusiastic about it. Second, and the political system France designed for Lebanon, a confessional system allocating government positions among religious communities in proportion to their population, as recorded in a 1932 census, was essentially frozen into the constitution. The president of Lebanon was to be a Maronite Christian, the prime minister, a Sunni Muslim, the speaker of parliament, a Shia Muslim. The census data on which this allocation was based became immediately politically contested, because every community had an interest in being counted as large as possible, and because the demographic balance was not static. The Lebanese confessional system still in place today, a century after its creation, is one of the more enduring monuments to the particular kind of damage you can do when you design a political system based on demographic categories you have frozen in amber and inscribed in law. Lebanon's 15-year civil war, which killed an estimated 150,000 people between 1,975 and 1,990, was driven in significant part by the accumulated tensions of a political system that could not peacefully adapt to demographic change because the system's designers had hardwired demographic categories into the constitutional architecture. The interior of Syria became the French mandate for Syria. The French suppressed the nascent Arab nationalist government that Faisal had established in Damascus. They defeated it militarily at the Battle of Maysalun in July 1920. Within months of the mandate's establishment, and imposed a colonial administration, when Syrian nationalists rose in the Great Syrian Revolt of 1925, 1927. The French suppressed it with extensive aerial bombardment and artillery fire, including shelling Damascus itself, killing thousands of civilians. After World War II, when Syrian independence finally came, it came into a country that had been administered as a French colonial territory for 25 years. That had been deliberately divided along sectarian lines. The French had, at various points, tried to create separate Alawite and Druze states within Syria as a divide-and-rule strategy, and that inherited a political culture shaped by occupation, resistance, and the manipulation of communal identities by a colonial power. The Alawite community, historically a marginalized minority in Syrian society, around 12% of the population, rose to prominence within the Syrian military during the French Mandate period, partly because the French, following their divide-and-rule logic, deliberately recruited minorities into the officer corps. Decades later, this pattern produced the Ba'athist coup of 1963 and, eventually, the Assad family's seizure of power in 1970. A minority Alawite regime ruling a Sunni-majority country, backed initially by the military structures that French colonialism had helped shape. The Syrian civil war that began in 2011, which has killed somewhere between 500,000 and 600,000 people, and displaced more than 12 million, cannot be reduced to a single cause. But the structural tensions that made Syria's political system so fragile, a minority governing a majority, in a state whose borders enclosed communities with different and sometimes incompatible political aspirations. In a region where external powers had a long history of manipulating internal divisions, these tensions were, in substantial measure, the inheritance of the mandate system. And then there was Palestine. Palestine is, in the history of Sykes-Picot's consequences, the most extreme case. The territory entered the mandate period with a population that was approximately 80% Arab Muslim, 10% Arab Christian, and 10% Jewish. These communities had lived in the region for generations, in varying degrees of coexistence and tension under Ottoman administration. The Balfour Declaration, Britain's 1917 promise to support a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, created an immediate and irresolvable structural problem. A national home implies immigration, settlement, and eventual political dominance. An existing population with its own national and political aspirations was unlikely to welcome this process. The Declaration's own caveat, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, was, in the face of the logic of national home building, a promise that simply could not be kept, not because anyone necessarily willed it to fail, but because the structural logic of what was being promised to one party was incompatible with the guarantee being offered to the other. This is not a statement about whether the Jewish national project in Palestine was justified or unjustified. Those are questions I am deliberately not answering in this episode. What I am saying, what the historical record straightforwardly supports, is that the British government, in making the Balfour Declaration, made a commitment that was in structural tension with its existing commitments to the Arab population of Palestine, and that Britain, as the mandatory power, was then placed in the position of trying to manage that tension, a task at which it consistently failed, and which eventually exploded into violence that has not yet ended. Transjordan deserves a mention, if only for the bluntness of how it was created. In March 1921, Winston Churchill, then colonial secretary, convened the Cairo Conference to reorganize British commitments in the Middle East. Over 10 days, Churchill redesigned the British mandates. One of the key decisions was the establishment of Transjordan, the territory east of the Jordan River, as a separate political unit under the rule of Abdullah, another son of the Sharif of Mecca. Churchill himself later described this as having been done with a stroke of the pen on a Sunday afternoon. He meant it as a slightly self-deprecating acknowledgement of the informality of the process. He did not mean it as a moral criticism. He should have. A stroke of a pen on a Sunday afternoon. A country, or the line that enclosed what would become a country, created in the time it takes to drink a cup of tea. Mark Sykes died in 1919. He was 39 years old. He died of influenza during the Paris Peace Conference. Before he could see the full consequences of the agreement he had helped to construct, his early death has given him a certain insulation from historical responsibility. The man who drew the line was not present to see what the line did. François Georges-Picot lived until 1951. He was 80 years old when he died. He had ample time to observe the consequences of the agreement that bears his name. He did not, in anything he wrote or said in the public record, express significant regret. The map remained. Let me try to describe what the map remaining means in practical terms. For the century that followed 1916, Iraq was governed as a British mandate until 1932, when formal independence was granted, though British influence and military basing rights continued. The Hashemite monarchy that Britain had installed proved unable to create genuine national cohesion among Iraq's structurally divided communities. The monarchy was overthrown in a violent coup in 1958, initiating a period of coups and counter-coups that eventually brought the Ba'ath Party in. Within the Ba'ath Party, Saddam Hussein to power. The structural problem that British diplomats had identified in 1916, the incompatibility of placing Mosul's Kurds, Baghdad's Sunni Arabs, and Basra's Shia Arabs within a single state, expressed itself repeatedly. The Shia majority was systematically excluded from political power. The Kurds were periodically attacked, their cultural identity suppressed, their language banned in public education, their villages destroyed in military campaigns. The 1988 Anfal campaign against the Iraqi Kurds, in which Saddam Hussein's forces used chemical weapons against Kurdish villages, including the attack on Halabja in March 1988, that killed an estimated 3,000 civilians in a single day, is perhaps the most extreme expression of the violence that structural political incompatibility, weaponized by a dictatorship, can produce. The use of chemical weapons against civilians in Halabja was a war crime. It was also, in a structural sense, the product of a state that had been designed without any mechanism for the Kurdish community to exercise political voice. The 2003 invasion of Iraq, driven by the Bush administration's conviction that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, which it did not remove Saddam Hussein and dissolve the Ba'athist state apparatus. It also removed the coercive mechanism that had been holding Iraq's fractured communities in an enforced equilibrium. What followed was a sectarian civil war of extraordinary violence, Sunni insurgency, Shia militia activity, Kurdish consolidation of the north, Al-Qaeda, and eventually ISIS, establishing control over significant Sunni majority areas. An estimated 150,000 to 500,000 Iraqis died in violence between 2003 and 2011. The number continues to be contested by researchers. None of this is solely or even primarily Sykes-Picot's fault. Saddam Hussein's choices were his own. The Bush administration's decision to invade Iraq was its own. The various armed actors who chose violence made their own choices. History is not deterministic. Lines on a map do not compel specific outcomes, but they shape the terrain on which outcomes occur. They determine what pressures accumulate, what communities coexist without the mechanisms to coexist productively, what grievances have no legitimate political outlet and therefore seek illegitimate ones. The borders of Iraq has drawn three communities, incompatible interests. No natural political glue created a state that required either remarkable political wisdom or sustained coercive power to hold together. It got neither for very long. Syria's trajectory tells a similar, though differently shaped, a story. The French Mandate ended in 1946 with Syrian independence. What France left behind was a state with a functional military, a working administration, and a set of structural political contradictions, specifically the overrepresentation of minorities in the officer corps that made it susceptible to military coups. The 1960s and early 1970s saw a series of coups and counter-coups, culminating in Hafez al-Assad's seizure of power in November 1970. Hafez al-Assad was Alawite from a community that had historically been at the bottom of the Syrian social hierarchy, associated with poverty and powerlessness, and that had been recruited into the military by the French precisely because marginalized minorities make loyal soldiers when given access to power they would otherwise not have. Under the French, Alawites rose in the military. Under the Ba'ath Party, Alawites consolidated power. Under Hafez Assad, Alawite families occupied the core security and intelligence positions that made the state machinery function. When Hafez Assad died in 2000, and his son Bashar inherited power in an election in which Bashar received 97% of the vote. Running unopposed, the Syrian state was an aging autocracy with a restless population, deep economic inequalities, and political institutions calibrated for control rather than governance. When the Arab Spring reached Syria in March 2011 and demonstrators took to the streets calling for reform, the Assad government's response: violent suppression, mass arrests, torture of detainees including children, transformed a protest movement into an armed insurgency. The 2015. The Syrian civil war had generated the largest refugee crisis since World War II. More than 5 million Syrians had fled to Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Europe. More than 6 million were internally displaced within Syria. The country's cities Aleppo, Homs, Raqqa had been reduced to rubble by a combination of government barrel bombing, rebel fighting, and foreign intervention. The borders that Sykes-Picot drew in 1916 enclosed all of this. They enclosed a country whose political structure had been shaped by French mandate policy, whose communities had been manipulated against each other for decades, and whose government had no mechanism for peaceful political transition. And then, in June 2014, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant ISIS captured Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq, and declared the establishment of a caliphate. In the weeks that followed, ISIS fighters drove to the Iraqi-Syrian border and began destroying the border-crossing markers with bulldozers while their media team filmed it. The footage went viral. The message was explicit: we are erasing the Sykes-Picot borders. The caliphate recognized no line drawn by European imperialists in 1916. This was, in its way, a remarkable piece of historical awareness for a genocidal organization. ISIS was correct that the borders were artificially constructed. ISIS was correct that the partition of the Arab world by European powers had produced lasting damage. The caliphate they offered as an alternative, a theocratic state founded on systematic mass murder, sexual slavery, and the destruction of pre-Islamic heritage, was not an improvement on the Sykes-Picot order, but the diagnosis detached from the remedy. I was not wrong. The use of Sykes-Picot as a mobilizing narrative, the idea that the region's problems originate in European imperial division and can be solved by erasing those divisions by force, has been a recurring feature of Middle Eastern politics since at least the 1950s. Arab nationalist movements, Ba'athist pan-Arabism, various Islamist movements, all have, at various points, identify the artificial nature of the post-World War I borders as a fundamental grievance. The resonance of this narrative is not difficult to explain. The borders are artificial. The divisions they enforced have been genuinely harmful. The people on both sides of these lines often share more in common than the borders imply. That this accurate diagnosis has been repeatedly mobilized by movements that had no genuine interest in the welfare of the people they claimed to be liberating, that Arab nationalism produced its own forms of authoritarianism, that Baathism produced Saddam Hussein, that Islamism of the ISIS variety produced mass atrocity does not make the diagnosis wrong. It makes the history more tragic. Let me now address the historiographical debate that has been building throughout this episode, because it is a real and important one. Is it fair to blame Sykes-Picot for all of this? The short answer is no, not entirely. And the long answer is, but it is fair to blame it for more than is comfortable to acknowledge. The not entirely part is important. Several historians, particularly those who push back against what they call the Sykes-Picot myth, have argued that the agreement has been unfairly scapegoated as the origin of all Middle Eastern problems, and that this scapegoating serves certain contemporary political agendas. Their arguments are worth taking seriously. First, the borders that actually emerged from the post-World War I settlement were not exactly the borders of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The agreement was substantially revised at the Paris Peace Conference, at the San Remo Conference in 1920, and in subsequent negotiations. The actual mandate lines reflected the outcome of post-war bargaining rather than the direct implementation of the 1916 map. To the extent that specific borders are to be blamed for specific problems, the 1916 agreement is not always the right target. Second, many of the borders in the region that seem most natural, the borders of Egypt, the Arabian Peninsula states, also have their origins in colonial-era decisions, and yet they have not generated the same levels of systemic instability as Iraq and Syria. This suggests that it is not borders per se that cause problems, but the particular combination of borders with other factors: demographic composition, oil wealth, external intervention, governance choices. Third, and perhaps most importantly, people make choices. The Ba'ath Party chose authoritarianism. Saddam Hussein chose genocide. Bashar al-Assad chose to barrel bomb his own cities. These choices were not determined by a map drawn in 1916. They were made by specific people in specific circumstances for specific reasons. Blaming Sykes-Picot for everything risks becoming a form of historical determinism that denies the agency of the actors who actually made the catastrophic decisions. These are serious arguments. They deserve to be acknowledged, but they do not, I think, substantially change the fundamental assessment. Because here is what is true. The Sykes-Picot settlement created states whose populations had no meaningful input into their own political organization, whose borders encoded the strategic and economic interests of foreign powers rather than the needs and preferences of local communities, whose internal structures, in the case of Iraq and Syria, were designed in ways that stored up sectarian and ethnic tensions without providing mechanisms for their peaceful resolution, and whose relationship with European and later American power was, from the beginning, a relationship of dependency and manipulation rather than genuine partnership. These structural conditions did not determine specific outcomes, but they created conditions in which bad outcomes were persistently more likely. They created states with structural fragility, states that required extraordinary political wisdom to govern well, and that got, with some exceptions, governance of varying degrees of inadequacy. The fragility created opportunities for bad actors. The bad actors made the crises, but the fragility was baked in. There is also one more thing that the blame Sykes-Picot critique, at its best, is really about not just the specific borders, but the mode of decision-making, the mode of two foreign officials deciding, without consultation, what political structures would suit the people in question. The mode of empire of the assumption that the powerful can simply redesign the world of the less powerful according to their own interests and preferences, and that the less powerful will eventually be grateful. That mode of decision-making did not end with Sykes-Picot. It continued through the Mandate period. It continued with the British and French decisions at every point of crisis to prioritize their own interests over the interests of the populations they claimed to be guiding towards self-government. It continued with the Cold War competition in the Middle East, in which both the United States and the Soviet Union supported authoritarian regimes that served their strategic interests regardless of what they did to their own populations. It continued with the 2003 Iraq invasion, in which the United States dissolved the Iraqi state on the assumption that what replaced it could be designed in Washington. The specific pencil lines drawn by Sykes and Picot in 1916 are not, in themselves, the totality of the problem. The totality of the problem is the civilizational assumption that produced those lines, the assumption that the powerful have the right to organize the world of the less powerful according to the powerful's interests and frameworks, and that the populations thus organized should be grateful for the management. Sykes and Picot were not uniquely villainous. They were, in many ways, quite ordinary. They believed what educated men of their time and class were supposed to believe. They acted in ways that their institutional context rewarded. They made a map. The map is still there. Some of the wounds are still fresh. Here is the moment that stays with me, the detail that I find most clarifying in the entire Sykes-Picot story. It is not the secret meetings in London. It is not the betrayal of the Arabs, monstrous as that was. It is not even the 3 contradictory promises about Palestine. It is this: in 1919, at the Paris Peace Conference, Woodrow Wilson authorized the King Crane Commission, an American fact-finding mission, dispatched to Syria and Palestine, to actually ask the people in those territories what they wanted. The King Crane Commission did its work. It traveled the region. It gathered testimony from communities across Syria and Palestine. It produced a detailed report documenting the preferences of the local populations, strong preference for independence or, if outside supervision was necessary, a mandate under American or British rather than French governance, significant majority opposition in Palestine to unlimited Jewish immigration and to the establishment of a Jewish state. The report was submitted in August 1919. It was not published. It was suppressed, filed away by the State Department. Not released to the public until 1922, by which time the mandate assignments had been decided, the post-war settlement had been locked in, and the populations who had been consulted had been organized into political arrangements that bore no relationship to what they had expressed wanting. The one time the people affected were actually asked what they wanted, their answers were suppressed because the answers were inconvenient. That is not a footnote. That is the story. There is, in discussions of the Sykes-Picot Agreement and its legacy, a temptation to arrive at a concluding lesson, a tidy takeaway, a moral that can be extracted and applied. A temptation should be resisted, because the history is too complicated and too ongoing for tidy takeaways. But there are things that can be said. The borders that Sykes and Picot drew and the broader settlement they were part of created states that many of their inhabitants do not identify with as primary political communities. In Iraq, many Shia Muslims identify more strongly with the global Shia community, or with the shrine cities of Najaf and Karbala, than with Iraq as a political unit. Many Iraqi Kurds do not identify with Iraq at all. In Syria, many Syrians identify more with their specific religious or ethnic community than with a Syrian national identity that is, after all, less than a century old and associated primarily with the authority of a state that suppressed them. In Lebanon, political identity is explicitly confessional. You are Maronite, or Sunni, or Shia, or Druze, and those categories determine what political options are available to you. When the states fail, and they have failed, repeatedly, catastrophically, people fall back on the community identities that predate the states. The Shia community, the Kurdish community, the Sunni Arab community, the Alawite community. These communities were there before Sykes and Picot drew their lines. They will be there when the current iteration of the states built on those lines eventually undergoes whatever transformation comes next. The line from Acre to Kirkuk is still on the map. People are still dying along it. And somewhere, in a London archive, there is the original document, the Asia Minor Agreement, signed on May 16, 1916, bearing the marks of 2 men who thought they were solving a problem, and who were, in fact, creating one that would outlast them by more than a century, and which shows no signs of resolving. That is, ultimately, the lesson that Sykes-Picot teaches. Not that borders are inherently illegitimate. All borders are, in some sense, constructs, and the world requires some borders to function. Not that empire was uniquely evil, though it was often evil. And the historical record on this is not ambiguous. The lesson is simpler and more disturbing than either of those, that decisions made in confidence, in secrecy, by the powerful, about people who are not in the room, that these decisions have a way of persisting far beyond the intentions of the people who make them. far beyond the lifetimes of the people who are immediately harmed by them, and far beyond the ability of anyone to simply declare them obsolete and move on. Maps are not neutral. Lines are not innocent. And the room where the Middle East was invented is still, in ways both literal and metaphorical, in session.